wraps up before the session. So I'll be facilitating the session today, and just a couple of housekeeping things that we'll go over before we get started. So in terms of our learning space, we are excited to have Dr. Jillian Peterson here to present to us today. There is so much misinformation that we have continued to see present in social media. And so it is nice to have an expert here to provide updates on her research, current epidemiology of mass shootings, and really sort of tangible actions that we all can take. In terms of interacting with the session today, we ask that you use the Q&A function to ask questions. There are a large crowd of individuals already signed on, and so we will look through the Q&A to have Dr. Peterson answer these questions live. And so be sure to use that throughout the talk if something comes to mind. Additionally, it's important just to remind all of us to practice self-care as needed. Topics that are going to be covered today are sensitive, and we encourage everyone to practice self-care as needed. And if you need to step away for any moment of time, please do that. And please also let us know if there's anything that we can do in that regard. This session is being recorded, so this presentation will be available through our Injury Prevention Research Center site at Emory's YouTube channel. A little bit about our Injury Prevention Research Center at Emory. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Violence Prevention Task Force. If you've not heard about IPRICE before, to share a little bit about our organization, it's a collaborative, multi-institutional research center dedicated to mitigating the staggering impact of injury in Georgia and the southeastern United States. And the center really acts as a bridge for us to work on research to practice in communities across the state. It focuses on developing innovative research, engaging partners, supporting innovative programs, and providing education and training opportunities such as this one this morning. And we address specifically 5 particular areas, and we try to mobilize resources in these areas. And that includes transportation, injury prevention, overdose prevention and drug safety, violence prevention, including suicide, older adult falls, and traumatic brain injury. And IPRICE does a lot of this work with a network of our partners to disseminate our research findings, innovative programs, and really to promote all of our injury prevention related events. For Region 4, I'd now like to pass it to Liz Cadell, who's our training specialist at the Region 4 PHTC, to present on their center.
Hi, everyone. Just want to give a quick overview of what the Region 4 Public Health Training Center is. So we are one of 10 HRSA-funded regional public health training centers. Our training center primarily serves the 8 states in the Southeast. So you can see our states over to the right, along with our training partners. So we work with 7 community-based training partners and 2 technical assistance providers to serve the entire region. And in doing this, we help build and sustain a skilled workforce with free learning tools and support designed to meet the unique needs of professionals in state and local public health departments. So we offer professional development for the workforce, experiential learning for students, and consulting and technical assistance to health departments. Our website is listed on this slide, so definitely feel free to check that out. You can see some other trainings that we offer and some on-demand options as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jillian Peterson is a professor of criminology at Hamline University and director of their forensic psychology program. She's also executive director of the Violence Prevention Project Research Center, a grant-funded center focused on reducing violence through accessible and actionable data and research. Dr. Peterson started her career as a special investigator in New York City, researching the psychosocial life histories of men facing the death penalty. She earned her PhD in psychology and social behavior from the University of California, Irvine, and has led research studies on mental illness and crime, mass shootings, crisis intervention, and school violence prevention. She was a principal investigator on a 3-year NIJ-funded project studying the life histories of mass shooters, which resulted in an award-winning book, The Violence Project: How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic. She's also a regular contributor to outlets like CNN, the New York Times, and National Public Radio. And without further ado, I would like to now pass it on to our speaker, Dr. Peterson. And I will stop sharing so that you can share. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning to discuss this heavy topic. I'm going to share my slides here. There we go. Um, so as was mentioned, please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A. I'm not going to look at them for the first section where I'm speaking, but then I'm very happy to answer all of your questions afterwards. So, as was mentioned, my background, I started off not as an academic. I started out as an investigator, working with men facing the death penalty in New York City. And it was my job to go to Rikers Island. I was a baby in my early 20s, meet with all these people who had committed these horrific crimes and try to figure out kind of what their pathway to violence was. So we would interview anybody that knew them, gather records, talk to moms, social workers, preschool teachers, anybody we could find that would help show the story of kind of how they got to the point of committing a murder. And those at the time were used in their sentencing hearings. In doing that work, I became really interested in violence prevention because it was so clear every time you could see all the places that that person's story could have gone in a totally different direction if this had happened or this had happened or somebody had noticed this. I never met a person where I felt like the violence they committed was inevitable. It always felt like there was so many places that intervention could have happened. So that's kind of my perspective in doing this work. I'm a psychologist by training. Oh, there we go. Um, and then I'm in a criminology department. So this project started around 2017 with a group of volunteer undergraduate students at Hamline University, who were really dead set on doing something. This was right after the Vegas shooting is when we really got started on this work. And I was doing things like Googling what percentage of mass shooters have a mental illness and could not find answers. And it became clear to me that we really didn't understand this very specific group of people, people who are going into public spaces, firing indiscriminately at people they don't know, and killing as many people as possible. It's a phenomenon that was happening more and more, but we really didn't have data to understand it. So we started building a database and we basically listed every person we could find. The database goes back to 1966. It starts with the Texas Bell Tower shooting, which is known as kind of one of the first public mass shootings. The perpetrator stood at the top of a bell tower and fired down at a campus in Texas, and it ended up being caught on live TV, and people watched it, and it's kind of known as the first public one. But there's been mass shootings long before that. We have a really narrow definition for the purpose of our database. And I want to be clear about that because depending on your definition, there's 8 mass shootings a year or 500. Both of those statistics are correct. They just measure mass shootings differently. And I think it's important to be clear about your definition and why you're using it because there's certain definitions that make sense for different research questions. So we use this definition of 4 or more people killed in a public space, not as a part of any other type of felony. So not a drug deal gone bad, not retaliatory violence, not a robbery that's gone bad. And at least half the victims have to be non-family. If we were studying family annihilations, that is by far and away the most common form of a mass shooting. And we are actually building a family annihilation database right now. But this one is very focused on that sort of subset of people we are trying to understand. This grant actually came to us under the first Trump administration as an effort to really study the psychosocial life histories of these individuals and understand what the pathway to violence is. So the database that we built now has over 200 perpetrators in it, and they are each coded on, I want to say about 230 variables. So it's everything from how they grew up to what happened the day before the shooting. We have every gun used in a mass shooting coded as a separate gun database. So you can look up exactly how perpetrators got their guns, what the guns were, if they were modified. We have a victims database. And we try to make it kind of this living, breathing thing. We're never done with it. There's always mass shootings being added. There's always more detail coming out. It's coded on publicly available information, which is one of the reasons we used four more people killed because those, well, A, at the time, that is what we were required to based on our funding, but B, those are the cases where you just see a lot of publicly available information. Um, but that's imperfect. We often don't even code a case until about 6 months after because the information in the first 24 to 48 hours is rarely correct. Um, we add variables based on public conversations, based on suggestions. So, for example, we have added SSRI medication use. We've added violent video games. We've added all of the different adverse childhood experiences. We've added political affiliation. We've added things. And the goal is to add data to our conversations. So we're not just guessing, we're not basing things on single case studies. We can say, here is the data, right? Like, here is actually how many perpetrators take SSRI medications. Look, it's very similar to rates in the general population. And so, how do we bring data into our conversations? If you go to the violenceproject.org, there's data visualizations, and the full databases are publicly available. You can download them. You can ask your own questions. You can suggest new variables to us. We're very open to it. And I'll mention we've now built a lot of new databases. So there's one every homicide in a K-12 school, every homicide in a house of worship. We are working on every homicide in a medical setting, which might be really interesting for this group. We hope to have that out probably January. But again, just building data. This is all built by undergraduate students, sort of digging around the dark corners of the internet, just trying to put this data together for us. And as part of that grant, we also were able to do interviews. So we ended up sending letters to every perpetrator in the database who was alive. So every mass shooter who had killed four or more people, which is not, I mean, it's actually a pretty small number because the vast majority die in the act. They're designed to be suicides. But we wrote to about 30, 32 perpetrators we could identify. We got about 10 letters back. A couple saying no, a couple from attorney, but seven perpetrators agreed to be interviewed. We ended up only getting access to five. But so we did interviews mostly by letter and over the phone because of COVID, but we were able to ask questions to these individuals about their trajectory to violence, about how they thought about it now, about what they'd done, which just kind of helped breathe some life into the data. And then we also interviewed about 50 other people, victims, people who knew perpetrators. I think we interviewed about four or five mothers of perpetrators, mental health professionals who missed signs, kind of anyone we could talk to get this really 360 view of this issue. And as mentioned, all of this is outlined in this book that's called The Violence Project, How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic. So if you want more, particularly the interview data, check this out. And I will point to kind of two chapters here. So the first one is called Monsters. And that's came from this idea that a lot of our public policy and our thinking is based on this idea that the only people who do this are monsters, right? You have to be this horrible monster. And so we've built systems to kind of lock monsters out and hide from monsters and kill monsters. But the reality is, these are people who are really insiders. These are individuals who are in our classrooms, who are in our workplaces, who we see every day. And I think we miss things because we can't imagine that anyone around us could possibly do this. So it's kind of this shift of thinking from an outsider to an insider. Um, and then the last chapter is called Hope. And although it is a little bit feeling hopeless right now, I did walk away from like being immersed in this 24/7 with a feeling of hope and that these are not inevitable. I will say we are in the middle of a cluster right now. These mass shootings tend to cluster. There tends to be like three or four within 2 or 3 week period, and then sort of a cool off, and then you see a bunch more again. And we are in the middle of a cluster right now, and that is always just really scary and overwhelming. So I want to acknowledge that it's all very heartbreaking. All of this is we practice this idea of public criminology. So put a bunch of sources at the bottom, but the idea of public criminology is that you are doing criminology not to publish it in peer-reviewed journal articles, although you should do that too, but not to present it at academic conferences, but for the point of changing the public conversation, informing the public, making all of the data, all of the research findings, all of the statistics something that people can wrap their heads around. So you don't need a PhD to understand them. So that is our goal, writing lots of op-eds, talking to media, trying to translate data into things that people can wrap their heads around. So what did we find? Who are the mass shooters? And I will say, this is changing, right? I can tell you what we know about the statistics, but it's a fluid situation in terms of who the mass shooters are. But here's what we know right now. They are 98% male. So this has been a conversation in our database. There is one transgender perpetrator. If we go out and say two or more killed, you get 4 or 5 transgender perpetrators, but the vast majority are male. I think we have 4 female perpetrators in our database, 2 who committed a crime with their male partners. So 2 solo female perpetrators. Shooters tend to be insiders. This is especially true for K-12 schools, where it's vast majority current student or former student. Elementary schools are targeted exclusively by former students. High schools and middle schools tend to be current students. College university shootings, current students, right? Workplace shootings, current employees. A lot of what we do is spend a lot of money on really high tech, fancy security systems, right? Metal detectors and now AI or drones, or I mean, it's a $4 billion industry, the school safety industry. That all assumes that you're blocking out an outsider, right? If you think about it, if the perpetrator is most likely a kid in that school, they are going in and out of those systems every day. They know exactly how they work. They know exactly where the weak points are. They run through the drills with everybody else. They know where the armed guards are. So it really shifts your thinking. It's harder. You can't really lock out an insider, but in some ways, prevention's easier because you can actually get to know the insiders and know when something's changing. Second fact is that shooters are in crisis. So we define a crisis as a noticeable change in behavior from baseline. We have a whole bunch of different categories under that, right? Some people it's agitation, it's aggression, it's isolation, it's paranoia. But essentially it means that people around them are noticing that something is wrong. They're not thinking that they're going to commit a mass shooting, but they are thinking about, they're noticing that this person is off. Nearly everyone in the database, we can say, had at least one sign of a crisis. Majority had 4 or 5. This is a piece in the New York Times. It's a visual op-ed where they kind of pulled out all those crisis signs from the database. If you're interested, it's a very powerful piece. But yes, in a state of crisis. The other important thing about a state of crisis is that it's not permanent. It is a moment in time where kind of your emotional reaction to things happening to you overwhelm your coping mechanisms and you can't deal and people are noticing, but it does not last forever. Always get this question about mental illness and mass shootings. So mental illness and mass shootings is a complicated question. If we look at prior hospitalization for psychiatric reasons, it's about 20% of mass shooters, which is much higher than the general population. Psychiatric medication use is about on par with the general population. Same with mood disorders. Thought disorders are overrepresented. So about 1% of the general population has a thought disorder. About 27% of mass shooters have a thought disorder. That does not mean that that thought disorder directly caused the mass shooting, right? Which I think is where it gets messy. For each of these, mostly men, it's this long trajectory towards violence that involves lots of different things. Mental illness is a part of that for some of them. It's not a part of it for others. We tried to really go through the cases and code the role of psychotic symptoms. So psychosis being hallucinations and delusions primarily is what we coded. Because those are the ones where it's sort of, you can see like this delusion or this hallucination caused violence. When it's depression or mania, it gets trickier because impulsivity and hopelessness, those are things that cause violence for people with and without mental illness. So it gets harder to tease that apart. But psychosis is generally something that you're not experiencing without a mental illness. So it was about 70% of perpetrators, psychosis played no role. About 11%, it played a minor role, meaning they were experiencing symptoms, but their motivation was really something else. It's only about 10% of cases where we could say this person was actively psychotic and they were responding to those symptoms and committing mass violence. So that's 10% is a lot, but it's the other 90% that's not. And so I think when we ask this simple question, like, does mental illness cause mass shootings? Yes and no, it depends, right? It's messy. I will say nobody who does this is kind of a mentally healthy person, and that's where it's a trickier conversation. So we can talk about mental illness, kind of capital MI, here's the diagnoses, here's the symptoms, but there's also this idea of mental wellness, which is kind of mass shooters are hopeless, they're isolated, they're angry, right? They're disconnected, even if they don't have a specific diagnosis. The third finding is that mass shootings are suicides. They are designed to be a final act. We have updated it to say final act because there's actually one trend we're seeing is more mass shooters wanting to stay alive after the mass shooting in prison to kind of watch the notoriety play out. We've seen that a few different times where, there was a school shooting in Oxford where the perpetrator literally sat down and put his hands in the air because he wanted to experience the aftermath. But still you go in with no plan after this. This is it, right? Like either you're going to kill yourself, you're going to be killed, or you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. You're not throwing on a disguise. You're not running because you don't want to. You actually are looking for the notoriety. You are looking to be seen. You are forcing people to watch and witness you. And so you have to be a part of that story. You want to be a part of that story. This is a well-known, actually a female school shooter, one of the only ones, who committed a mass shooting in 1979 at Grover Cleveland Elementary School. And this was when, from her parole hearing many, many years later, when they said, "Why did you commit the crime?" And she said, "Because I wanted to die. I was trying to commit suicide. Why pick the school across the street? Because I knew that if I fired on the school, the police would show up and they would shoot and kill me. And every time I had tried suicide in the previous year, I'd screwed it up." Suicide attempts are very common amongst mass shooters. Being actively suicidal is kind of a universal. And that's just something we see again and again. And so this has really important implications for prevention. If you want to be alive, you are not going to do this. Fourth commonality is that shooters study other shooters. So and this is especially true for the younger shooters and school shooters, they see themselves as a part of this community in a way. So these are people really disconnected, kind of in other spaces, but you can go online and Google, like, what do you do when you feel this way, and tumble down rabbit holes. A lot of them really idolize previous mass shooters, read all of their previous work, study the manifestos, are in Discord or Reddit chat rooms that really kind of celebrate this type of violence and promote it. This is something we've done some study of, but it's really difficult because the social media companies, once this happened, like everything's wiped down and disappeared and nobody gets access to it. But this piece is really critical and really important. So we think of social media as kind of an accelerator, that these are young people that, in the 90s for the Columbine perpetrators, they had to find each other, right? But now you can find anybody that you want online and really get some of this thinking quickly validated. They leak their plans. So leakage is actually the formal term, which means basically telling somebody that you're thinking about this. It could be in person, it could be posted online, it could be written down on notebooks that we've seen or homework assignments. This is a series of 3 papers that we've done looking at this idea of leakage. And what we find is that it really seems to be this kind of last ditch effort to be caught. The only reason you tell someone that you're thinking about doing this is because there is some part of you that wants to be stopped. It's kind of, oftentimes, it's kind of this screaming into the void. And so leakage also becomes really critical. It's a critical intervention point, but we have to do it right. What we've seen in a lot of schools, for example, is that if a person threatens violence or talks about violence or posts about violence, it's a quick disciplinary, right? Criminal charges, expulsion. Um, and there's a lot of school shooters who had just been expelled. It's just not a problem we can kind of expel our way out of or punish our way out of. We have to treat leakage as kind of a last-ditch cry for help and see it as a cry for help and then intervene accordingly, which I'll talk more about in a bit. Um, this is school mass shooters in particular. So 70% are studying others, nearly 90% are highly planned. A legacy token is something that you leave behind to be found. So a written manifesto, a YouTube video manifesto, some sort of letter, very common amongst school shooters. 94% told somebody that they were thinking about doing it. We've studied cases where 40, 50, 60 kids knew something was going to happen, that this kid was talking about this, and nobody told an adult. So this, again, really critical intervention point. I think we do sometimes have this thought that mass shooters haven't talked to anybody and they're not getting mental health intervention. But so we coded this idea of previous system contact, prior contact with law enforcement, prior mental health system contact, prior contact with official school officials or other different sort of formal officials. And it's the majority have had some sort of contact. So we're now starting a new study, kind of really looking at this piece, trying to talk to people and think about like, what questions should you be asking? And not to point blame or point fingers in any way, shape, or form, but like, what resources do you wish you had? What questions do you need to ask? In the book, we interviewed a social worker who had worked with one of the perpetrators that we interviewed 2 weeks before he committed mass shooting. And she was really young at the time and she knew something was wrong. And she talks about this feeling of like, I knew this was a big deal. This was really wrong. I was calling all these people. I couldn't find beds. I was telling my supervisor he wouldn't show up for another appointment. And like she felt like there's only so much that she could do. It was out of her hands. But she still carries a lot of guilt, which she should not. But part of this is understanding like what are the system barriers in place that prevent us from being able to intervene. They have access to guns. So a gun is needed to commit a mass shooting. So for school mass shooters they tend to be under 18. 60% of them are taking them from family, mostly parents, some grandparents, others who don't have those guns locked up. So they know how to get access and they're taking them from people in their lives. Others, I mean, the most common way other than that is to legally purchase. So this is different than sort of, I hate the term, but we call it sort of everyday gun violence or community gun violence. So that type of gun violence, vast majority committed with illegal firearms. Public mass shootings like this one, legal firearms. Many of them, we've seen this sort of trend about young people 18 to 24 or so who are purchasing guns when they turn 18. Um, Assault weapons in mass shootings have skyrocketed. People, when I started this project in 2017 and people would ask about assault weapons, I was like, yeah, I mean, it's a thing, but really it's almost all handguns. We're just not seeing it. That has completely shifted in the last 8 years, where now the vast majority of mass shootings do involve assault style weapons. Um, Part of that is the goal is to kill as many people as possible because you want to make the biggest headlines, right? That these are meant to be watched and witnessed. It is like a form of terrorism where the goal is to force people to see you, to get your message of hate and anger kind of out to the world. The more people you kill, the bigger the headlines, the more your name makes the history books. So assault weapons function that way. They've also, I think, become symbolic, right? If you're going to do a mass shooting, you kind of dress like a mass shooter, use the gun of a mass shooter. They copy each other, they study each other. And so assault style weapons have taken on this meaning in these shootings. This is a recent study that we did. where we surveyed 10,000 people across the United States, looking at a lot of different issues around gun violence. But one thing we asked was exposure to a mass shooting. Now, here's where we're using a different definition, and this is why, right? So we asked about, have you ever been on the scene where four or more people were shot in any context, right? So this could be a gang fight, this could be a fight that escalated at a bar. This could be whatever. Have you been on the scene? Because we were really trying to get at the experience of individual victims rather than, the psychosocial life history of the perpetrator. These numbers are wild to me. So if you look at present on the scene of a mass shooting, Gen Zs, like 13, 14% say they have been physically on the scene when a mass shooting happened. These numbers were so high that we didn't believe them, and we actually did the survey again. So rather than calling it a gun violence survey that you kind of had to opt into, we snuck the questions at the bottom of a survey about something else. Exact same numbers. And this has actually been replicated now by somebody else. And it's hard to imagine, but if you think every time there's a mass shooting, I mean, when there's a mass shooting at a club in downtown Minneapolis, there's thousands of people on the scene. When there's one on a college campus, there's tens of thousands of people on the scene. And so I think yes, mass shootings are rare events, but the number of people who are experiencing this and been exposed, and if you look at local community, it's also incredibly high numbers. So this is something that we kind of can't ignore. We looked at the mental health impact of these shootings. So these questions were, did you experience these things as a direct result of being on the scene of a mass shooting or as a direct result of having a mass shooting in your community? If you look at direct exposure, any mental health problems, it's, 80% nearly. But even if you look at community exposure, 60% of people are saying when there was a mass shooting in my community, I had a mental health impact, whether that's anxiety, depression, panic attack, post-traumatic stress. The dash lines are symptoms lasted longer than a year. So these are actually triggering long-term mental health impacts. And I will say right now, I'm happy to share these slides if people want to look closer at this. And this is a paper that was published in Nature Mental Health not long ago. So what do we do? I think everybody is kind of always looking for that one solution. I'm in Minnesota. We just had Melissa Hortman and her husband assassinated over the summer. We had an Annunciation shooting where 8 and 10-year-old children were killed in church pews while they were praying at school. We are in the midst of trying to have this conversation, right? Like, what do we need to do? And what it ends up being, it's like, well, it's either mental health or it's guns or it's this or it's that. None of these solutions are perfect. They all have problems. So we tend to use this kind of Swiss cheese model, the idea that every solution is imperfect, they all have holes. But when you start just doing them all, that's where the holes get covered up. So rather than debating, is this the perfect thing that's going to solve this? Set that conversation aside and say, is there a chance this will help? Let's do it. Cross the board. So this is the common pathway that we kind of have identified if we think about what is the life course of someone who does something like this. Starting out, adverse childhood experiences, really significant trauma histories. We ended up adding a column for parent who committed suicide because it was so common, right? Like this is significant abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, really severe. Not for all of them, but for many, hitting a crisis point or a breaking point. So typically, these are men who are isolated, who are disconnected, who are then become actively suicidal, very hopeless, and hit this point where it's kind of this crisis point, this suicidal point. Social proof is the idea that then they go out and they look for models of what to do. This is that kind of radicalization piece where they watch people who've done this before, they see people who've done this before, they want to be like these people and part of this community. And part of this is like forcing people to see you in a way that you're not seen. We interviewed one sister of a mass shooter, a very famous mass shooting. And she talked about the point at which her brother went from kind of what's wrong with me to whose fault is this? And that was an online platform that kind of shifted his thinking there. So that's a piece of this. And then finally, opportunity, which is you need access to guns and access to the place that you want to target. Perpetrators typically target locations that represent their grievance with the world. So workplace shooters are angry at work, school shooters are angry at school. Some people, it is women or a religious group or a particular political party that they've decided is the source of their anger. Um, we wrote we wrote an op-ed kind of a while ago that got some pushback, but the idea was that like that hatred is actually pretty late on the pathway to violence. It's like you've trauma, crisis, suicidality, and then you find who you hate and whose fault it is. But that's actually quite late on the trajectory. Um, this is not true for elementary school shooters, actually. So, elementary school shooters will say that they're not particularly angry at their elementary school. They target it because that's where you make headlines. If you kill young kids, that's what gets your message out. So, we can think about intervention at any of these places on the pathway. We tend to focus on opportunity, right? So, we talk about guns and we talk about building hardening. I think because for so long we didn't understand this pathway. Now that we know it, I think there's a lot more that we can do. Um, so in terms of implications for prevention, um, physical security is not going to be sufficient, especially if we're talking about school shootings. But for any type of shooting, physical security is not going to cut it if the perpetrator is an insider. And I mean, we just saw this. It's awful but it's something that I've been saying for a long time. You can have the best metal detector in the world. If someone walks through it shooting an AR-15, it doesn't work. If someone rams their truck through it, which is what we just saw happen in Michigan, it doesn't work. So physical security alone is not going to do it. That is where we put most of our resources. Crisis intervention is seems to be important here. So being able to recognize the signs of a crisis, especially because perpetrators are insiders that we see every day. What are the signs of a crisis? Well, how do I do crisis intervention? Suicide prevention also being a critical piece of this. I think everybody in the world should be trained in suicide prevention. It's something that anybody can do. I've had principals say I don't want my shop teacher doing suicide prevention. And it's like you 1,000% want your shop teacher to be able to do suicide prevention because if that's the where that kid's most comfortable and that's who he tells, they don't have to do long-term therapy, but they should be able to have a 10-minute conversation and get that kid hooked up to the right resources. Um, the fact that so many perpetrators leak their plans means we need reporting systems, anonymous reporting systems. There's data to show those are effective, whether those are in workplaces, houses of worship, schools, colleges. Also, strong relationships. And this is especially true for schools, right? Strong relationships between adults and kids in the building so they feel comfortable reporting. And we have to respond appropriately. If you report your concern about your friend and the response is that they criminally charged, no one's going to report ever again. So kind of holistic, balanced intervention focused on care and concern rather than punitive. And then opportunity, talking about school shootings, safe storage is huge. Any way we can help people secure firearms and any way we can kind of slow down access to firearms for somebody in an acute crisis. And this tends to be a place where gun owners and non-gun owners agree, right? If you are saying, I want to hurt myself or somebody else, you should not have your hands on a gun in that moment. So anything like permit to purchase, waiting periods, extreme risk protection orders, which I'll talk about that in a second, all those things essentially slow down access for somebody in an acute crisis. And all of these things are going to have a diffusion of benefits, right? So maybe you're doing this to prevent a school shooting, but if you build a care team like I'm going to talk about, or an anonymous reporting system, or you train people in crisis intervention, it's not just about mass shootings, obviously. It's about kids in crisis, whether that be mental health, whether that be self-harm, whether that be dating violence or cyberbullying, these types of systems have a broad impact. I also did want to touch on political assassination data. So we have a database of assassinations and attempted assassinations of elected officials going back, I think it goes back like 100 years. We are in an uptick in this. We have had more political assassinations and attempts in the past 2 years than any other 2-year period in history. That as far as we've been tracking. So the data here, it's not as good, the publicly available stuff. We're still working on it, but we know perpetrators about 90% male, 29% white, violent history, mental health history, crisis signs, warning signs, a lot of that same stuff. Also, these in the same way are meant to be watched, witnessed. They're meant to make a point. So rather than killing as many people as possible, you're targeting one high profile person, but it is the same way that you're kind of looking to get your message out there, and forcing people to know it and witness it. So this is another database that if you're interested, you can download and look at, and play with and suggest new variables to code. When we did that study of 10,000 people, one thing we asked was, here's 14 different reasons that mass shootings occur. Put these in rank order, right? Like, what do you think is the most important? What do you think is the least important? What we found is that Democrats and Republicans picked the same top 5 reasons, right? Out of a list of 14, there was a lot there. They picked the same top 5. Like, we actually agree more than I think our political conversations in public make it seem. So one side, Democrats tend to rank access to guns as highest, Republicans rank mental illness as highest, but both sides rank mental illness as a problem, right? And both sides do rank access to guns as a problem. And so I think this type of data can be like, let's bring this together. So it's access to guns, mental illness, hate bias, traumatic childhoods, and then something we're kind of calling evil personality. The fact that the same top 5 emerged to me was really heartening. This is one example of a way to slow down access to guns. So Minnesota recently passed an extreme risk protection order. I think these are in about 20 states. What this does is it says if you are actively making threats that you want to hurt someone or hurt yourself, law enforcement has a way to remove your guns for a short period of time, either 14 days or up to a year, based on kind of the evidence and what you've said. We've been tracking the cases where this is being used, and the evidence is astounding. I think there was some nervousness that maybe this would be misused. That is not what we're seeing. I mean, law enforcement removed 4 AR-15s from a guy set up across the street from the Mall of America, ready to commit a mass shooting. Law enforcement will say we didn't actually have a way to do this previously because they haven't actually committed a crime yet. They're just talking about it. But this is a way to say like, hey, we're worried about you. We're going to remove your guns and we're going to get you help for a brief period of time while you are in this crisis. And then we will give them back. They're different in each state. Minnesota's also means you can't purchase during that period. There's been a lot of cases where the individual is targeting law enforcement, where it's domestic violence, but I think it's about 10 threats of school shootings where they've actually gone in and removed weapons for a brief period of time. So this is one of those examples where it's like crisis and access come together and most people agree that is a clear intervention point. This is another project that we did. This was a 3-year federally funded project that we did in the St. Paul Public Schools, trying to build kind of a new school safety model for them. I won't go into this, but they had had a lot of trouble in the St. Paul Public Schools with guns and violence and even a stabbing, a homicide that occurred in a high school. And so we were brought in to kind of say, like, what should we be doing different here? One thing we did is we looked at all of the weapons cases, all of the threats of violence. We looked at cases of kids who had 3 or more incidents, right? And this is out of 33,000 students, I think, in the district. There was 59 students who rose to this level of sort of true concern. So who are bringing weapons again and again, crying out for help, showing that they're not okay. These are the ones that we want to target. So using data to have those conversations. And we built what we called a care team. For those of you on the call familiar with threat assessment, this is essentially a threat assessment team. I think threat assessment is wonderful. It's the idea that you bring people together, a multidisciplinary team with different perspectives. You dig in to a person who's threatening violence, you figure out the root causes and how dangerous it is, and you respond, right? The only thing I don't love about threat assessment is literally the title threat assessment, especially when you're in a school setting. I just think looking at young kids as threats, um, it just kind of shifts the thinking. When we called it a care team, which stood for collaborate, assess, respond, and evaluate, we got a completely different response from counselors, from social workers, from parents, from teachers. The buy-in was just really different when it was like, your kid is reported because we're concerned and we want to provide them care rather than your kid is being reported because we think they're a threat. So the idea of collaboration, care over exclusion, real-time data, and continuous learning. This has been a 3-year project that we are just wrapping up, and we just finished the evaluation. And what we find is it's actually having really good outcomes. So in every school in the district, we built a care team that had principal, counselor, social worker, assistant principal, public safety person, whoever that is, all in a room together when a concern was reported by anybody in the building. So a teacher noticed a kid in crisis, a sort of dramatic change in behavior, a threat of violence. It would go to the care team that meets weekly, could also have an emergency meeting, make an intervention plan, and then revisit it sort of each week and make sure it's working. And if the school hit a point where they didn't think they could handle it, they kicked it up to the district level care team. And that was usually cases that involved things more like the need for hospitalization or criminal charges that would go outside the school. In doing this analysis, we're finding really good results. Mostly it's about increased communication, right? Because a lot of times when these situations happen, you have all these people who are holding a puzzle piece and the puzzle pieces never came together. So just increased information sharing, increased collaboration, language matters we found. So like care team versus threat assessment made a difference, sort of unified data. How do we sort of keep track of all of this stuff? And then having the resources to intervene. And I will say when it comes to intervention, it can be so many things. It can be a very serious mental health intervention. It can be a low-key mental health intervention. It can just be like you need some peer support or you need somebody to talk to you on Fridays. Or we had one case where the kid was getting really escalated and threatening violence. And in digging into it, we found out he was not really eating food and he would get so disoriented coming off the bus that he would forget to eat. And then he would get angry. And his intervention was having someone meet him on the bus, walk him off. And this was a high schooler, walk him to the cafeteria and make sure he ate food. So the interventions have to kind of match the individual needs, but we are finding that this type of thing seems to be effective. When I talked about crisis intervention, this is a 4-step model that we've developed that we deliver this training in. When we've delivered this to reporters, to hotel workers, to police officers, to everyone, the idea of kind of managing yourself, managing the environment, and then nonverbal and verbal de-escalation techniques. For someone in a crisis, this can be incredibly effective just to have someone see you, notice you, and try to figure out what you're feeling and going through. This can take 10, 15 minutes. I think it's effective skills for people to have. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight this individual, Aaron Stark, who he has a TED Talk and he's written lots of pieces, does a lot of public speaking, but I think it's easy to get very overwhelmed when we talk about mass shootings and be like, okay, we need early childhood trauma, we need suicide prevention, we need, extreme risk protection orders, we need all these things that feel huge. Aaron talks about planning to commit a school shooting when he was a teenager. I think he was 19 when he had decided that he was going to commit a school shooting. He was from a horrifically abusive background. He was very depressed. He had been cutting for a long time. He was suicidal. He was hopeless. He was homeless. And he had a friend who invited him over, and it's one of his friends who was there, he realized they had gotten together because it was his birthday and somebody had baked him a pie. It was a peach blueberry pie that they had baked in honor of him being there. And he said that was the day he decided not to do a mass shooting, right? And that type of story was one that I heard again and again in doing interviews with perpetrators. I would always say, is there anyone or anything that could have stopped you? And they would always say yes. There was one perpetrator who actually said, I actually think anyone could have stopped me, but there was no one, right? And so this idea that like, yes, these are big, massive problems, but also that human connection, that kindness, a blueberry pie, crisis intervention, you don't know what good you are doing with that. And for people who are so hopeless and so far gone, just being seen can be so powerful. And so I do think that's the hopeful piece to take away from this is there's this idea of kind of like kindness and compassion and inclusion. That's a really important part of prevention. Okay, so this is theviolenceproject.org, my email address, and then we can shift to Q&A. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. That was a really interesting and fascinating talk, and so many things that I had misconceptions about, got cleared up with the data that you have shared. So thank you for that. We have a number of questions in the chat, so I'll just go through these from the top here. So the first question is regarding why limit the mass shootings in the database to those that killed at least 4 people? It seems like this would exclude plenty of incidents in which contexts, motivations, methods, etc., would be similar to those in the database, but just did not reach that lethality threshold. I think you touched on this a bit in the beginning about the definition. So if you have anything else to add about that.
Yeah, and there's no perfect definition, right? We've gone down to three or more, about doubles the number of people in the database, and it doesn't change the conclusion. So I think that's the big question, right? And we've gone to, I think, four or more, it's completely arbitrary. You can also choose three or more. You can choose 2 people killed, 2 people shot. What I think is the best definition, which is actually one we're working on with the data right now, is somebody going into a public space with the goal of firing indiscriminately to kill as many people as possible, regardless of how many people they end up hitting, right? And so by building all these new databases in K-12 schools, higher ed, house of worship, workplaces, that's what we're trying to do is being able to pull that out. But I think the real thing is like whether you do four or more or three or more, if you're focused on this very like public indiscriminate killing, you see the exact same demographics and findings emerge over and over again, kind of irregardless of definition.
Changing that definition, like you just mentioned, right, with more of the intent to kill and like the actual impact, is that live or is that something that you guys are working on now for the
We're
database?
working on that now. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
There's another question. Isn't there evidence that people with mental health issues are more likely to be victims? Jeff Swanson from Duke has looked into this extensively, and I know that you shared that, diagram of some of the risk factors.
Absolutely 1,000%. People with serious and persistent mental illness are much more likely to be victims than offenders, right? But I think this comes back to our kind of it can't just be an either or, right? Like you're a victim, not an offender. You're this. I think we have to embrace the nuance of this. The vast majority of people with serious persistent mental illness are nonviolent, right? The vast majority of people with psychosis are nonviolent, and are more likely to be victims. There are some people with psychosis who commit mass shootings, right? So those are both true things. And so how do we figure out how to have that conversation without stigmatizing people, but yet still acknowledging that sometimes this does happen and that intervention would have been helpful, right? I think we have to be willing to embrace the true complexity of sort of mental health and violence and victimhood and all that stuff. And then you mix in substance abuse and you mix in trauma and you mix in isolation and you mix in all these things. And it's complex.
Thank you. One question specifically is asking what a legacy token is.
Yeah, a legacy token is something you leave behind to be found. It is essentially you trying to create your legacy. Most often it's a manifesto, which is basically a journal. Some people leave timed YouTube videos. Some people mail videos of themselves to news stations like the Virginia Tech shooter. But it's essentially the thing that you hope people read, the thing you hope goes viral. And the sad truth is it does. People read them and they go viral. And so that's kind of what a legacy token is.
Thank you. There's another question regarding somebody specifically saying, I'm curious to know if there is any research done on how long after the legal firearm purchase the mass shooting happens for those who purchased on their own. And I know that there is data out there, but I'm wondering, what you've seen in sort of more recent years.
Yeah, so we have that coded. We basically code it as I want to say it's maybe within a month of the shooting and then 6 months of the shooting, a year. I don't know, but you can go in and you can look that up. It's again, this is all publicly available data. So it's really hard. We don't have some sort of registry of firearms in this country, so it's really hard to track this down. But based on publicly available information, we do have that coded. And it is oftentimes for like school shooters, retail shooters, sort of young shooters, it's pretty quickly within the purchase to committing the mass shooting. There's this kind of whole other group of shooters in their 40s, 50s who tend to, maybe they're fired from their job and they go out to their truck and they get their handgun out of the glove box and they go in and shoot people. That those are in the database, but it's a bit different.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one question and then pull in a question that we had gotten online because they're both kind of similar.
Mhm.
First, do you consider exposure to violent content online as an ACE and part of the trauma phase? And then the second question that can kind of be paired with this, can you comment on the effect of violent video games and or online gaming culture on the occurrence of mass shooting? So initially, whether or not violent content is an ACE.
So we don't count that as an ACE just because we use the traditional definition of the 10 ACEs, and that's not one of them. But I do think it's an important question. This idea of violent content exposure. I mean, it becomes this like causation versus correlation question, right? Like, are you drawn to those violent video games because of what you've been through? Are those violent video games escalating things? It's again, we know the VAT 99% of people, young people who play violent video games are not then committing violence. However, when we look at perpetrators of mass shootings, especially school shooters, a lot of them do spend many, many hours playing violent video games. Again, we can't say if that's causal or, that's something they enjoy doing because of other reasons. Um, I think it's the idea of desensitization, right? It's the idea of exposure to violence, of kind of that rehearsal, that accelerant. So we can't say yes, no to that, but I think it's part of the conversation. And I think we're still trying to tease that apart and people are still exploring it.
Great. There's another question related to ACEs. The ACEs aspect is so interesting, unsurprising, and sad. Has there been any research into PCEs, which are more of the sort of, positive events?
Mm. Um, no, we haven't coded. And like we are looking at the worst of the worst cases, right? Like so we're looking at the cases where everything failed and this person killed a lot of people, right? It's really hard to study prevention in these spaces. It's really hard to study somebody who was on this pathway to violence, but had a really good mentor and got off the path, right? Like, I would love to be able to study those cases. We have anecdotes, we have people that come to us and want to tell those stories, but we don't have a way to systematically study, like, how do positive experiences get people off this pathway? It's just fundamental about this type of work, right? We're never going to have an experimental control group. So like, how do we think about that? So there's not a ton of research, and I am really open to ideas about how to explore that for sure.
Thank you. And if we get any feedback after, people review your slides, we'll definitely send them your way.
Yes, please
Um,
do.
there's another question that I think we've already touched on, with that awesome map that you showed us, sort of like top five priorities for Democrats and Republicans. But I'll just sort of cover a little bit of it in case you wanted to say anything else. But this particular listener, basically said that they've used your database to locate the 10 largest shootings by numbers killed, and after looking at interviews and documentation, noticed that the Republicans are focusing on mental health illness, Democrats are focusing on access to firearms, and then the independent group is focusing on absent law enforcement. Then they sort of match that with motivation, ability, opportunity, theoretical frameworks, and the Republicans contributed to motivation, Democrats contributed to an ability, and independence contributed to an opportunity. In other words, you know, the definition of for sort of their mass shooter. One group would say, the Republicans would say homicidal maniac. Number two, the Republicans brandishes a loaded gun. And number three, who eludes the police. So if you have any comments related to that, I do think that you addressed sort of how similar, right, that like across sort of political divides, and really sort of across, political leanings, there are sort of the same five top priorities.
Yeah. Um, Great analysis. Want to look more into it, but I think this idea that like Republicans will say it's the individual, right? It's something's wrong with this person, whether that's mental illness or they're evil, but 99% of people who own guns would never think of doing this, right? And the other side is like, yes, 99% of people with mental illness who have this personality would never think of doing this, but it's the access to the guns. It's both correct, right? Like we just have to be willing to hear the other side and come to the middle. Most people who own guns don't commit violence. Most people with mental illness don't commit violence. There is a very small subset of people who do, and we need to figure out how to prevent that from happening. And I think these big, broad, it's this or that questions are just wrong. It's all of it. Like in our book, I think we
Mhm.
come up with 32 different solutions that would emerge from the data that were like, let's just start stacking them, right? Instead of pointing fingers and right or wrong, admit it's complicated and it's all of it.
Thank you. Another question, can AI be used to detect online leakage sooner?
Oh, there's a lot of people trying to answer that question right now. I mean, I think there's a lot of people trying to create AI. Eventually, yes, there's some data that says yes. Um, it's that whole piece is really hard, right? Like that balance between free speech and violent content and what we want to moderate and what we don't. Other countries have gone pretty quickly and just shut down. If you are operating a chat room that is glorifying violence, it's done. We don't do that in the United States for good or for bad, right? Like that's just we strongly appreciate free speech. And so threatening violence online, is that a crime? Is it not? Right? Like it's very much walks this middle ground. What we find is that AI or different detection mechanisms, like schools are already using things to try to identify threats from students on social media and stuff. That's the first step, but then you have to look deeper, right? We have had so many threats of school shootings in this country. The numbers are through the roof. I mean, after the Annunciation school shooting here, I think we had maybe 50 threats to local schools, right? Like this is just oftentimes young kids copycatting. Sometimes it's a joke, sometimes it's hoax, sometimes it's real. We don't have good ways to sort through that. We don't have great intervention mechanisms, but we have put so much on schools to have to navigate this on a daily basis. That my guess is AI will end up being helpful in some way. I'm just not exactly sure how.
Sure. There's another comment and question. So this person's a psychologist in New York and would love to bring this education around intervention in school systems and care teams to the schools in their area. Will this education be available via trainings at some point?
Yes, working on it. Absolutely. But they can certainly contact me. That is something that we are working on getting up. And we were waiting till kind of the final evaluation of the care team to say like, yeah, there's evidence this worked before we kind of went public with it. And we're just wrapping that up. So I'm hopeful that that'll be out soon.
Thank you. Another question. You touched on mental illness's role in mass shootings, that for the majority, psychosis did not play a major role in most mass shootings, but then also mentioned that nearly all mass shooters are suicidal or suicide is their final act. Can you clarify that distinction between mental health, the role of mental health, given the role of suicide as a driving force?
Yeah, and this is that like messy mental illness versus mental health, right? Like they're nearly all suicidal. Does being suicidal mean you have a specific diagnosed mental illness? No, right? Likely. But it's that's where the messiness is, right? Like none of them are mentally healthy. They're all suicidal. Have they been formally diagnosed and given a diagnosis of depression? No. If someone got in there, could they? Probably, yes. But like, so I think that's the messy part. But like you can be suicidal without technically meeting criteria for a diagnosis. But I think that's also the space that I want to like move away from, right? This like, what percentage had this diagnosis and blah, 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 because so many of them have not had mental health treatment or had the opportunity to have a diagnosis that it's hard to get at.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, there's another question specifically regarding when it comes to the political polarization surrounding mass shooting, particularly shooter motives, background. What do you think is the most effective way to actually combat misconceptions? Do you believe data presentations alone are sufficient?
I don't know. I would love help there. I feel like I try, we write a lot of op-eds, we give tons of presentations, we try to present at public policy hearings. But I don't totally know. Just the other day I saw that on Twitter. Elon Musk's like AI chatbot Grok found our database and was going around Twitter and like correcting misconceptions, which I thought that was very cool. So like I don't actually know. I just do think that like data is incredibly helpful if people are willing to see it and hear it from both sides. Like I just think that it's grounding. Like it's not angry. It's not political. Data is just data. And so if we can just start there and move out. One thing I think is unique about this conversation is that the end goal is the same, right? Like nobody wants children slaughtered in schools. Nobody. We disagree on the mechanism to get there, right? But there's other political conversations where we actually disagree on the end goal. This is not one of them. Like the agreement is, people should not be killed in public for no reason. And so we actually both want to get, everybody wants to get there. And so how we get there, that is really a data and science question. It's not a political one, right? And so I think if we're willing to see that and be open to it, we can get there. But in terms of political rhetoric, I don't know. That is outside my forte.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, I think whenever we are sort of talking about, gun violence prevention generally too, right? It's sort of about us reshifting our framework as this being a, public health crisis and a healthcare issue. And so sticking to sort of that framework and looking at the data and what the data shows. I personally feel, and given sort of my background and experience, it does open doors with individuals that may have completely, different perspectives. So there's another question. What are some alternatives to expelling and isolating youth in crisis should schools consider?
Yeah, and what I find is like when we train school leaders, I do a lot of school leader presentations, and they will say, like, I hear what you were saying, right? I get it. I get when a kid threatens to commit a shooting, they're actually crying out for help and they're actually saying, I'm hopeless and I'm in a bad spot. And I know that I should pull them in and wrap them around with resources, right? Try telling that to the 1,000 parents in my community, right? Like that when somebody says, I'm going to shoot up this school, parents want that kid out, and I'm a parent of 3 children who are in elementary school. I fully get it. Um, so I think it's kind of a reframing for all of us to think about, like, and it's setting expectations early, I think. So not having the first time you talk about your response to a threat be when you get a threat, but saying like, when we get a threat, here's how we respond. We blah, blah, blah. The data says that we should figure out where it's coming from, that we should sort of pull this student in, not push them out. That's the safest thing to do. And I think people are willing and open to those conversations. It's just so scary right now that I think the response is just like, get them out of here. But it just doesn't work.
Thank you. Um, there's a question, there was a prior question that they've clarified, so I'm going to read that one. Is a prior question about in reference to political shootings. This person has known that any political shootings to be committed has not known any political shootings to be committed by anyone other than somebody that is white. So 29%, I'm assuming was what the data on the slide was quite shocking to them. Is this because of the definition?
But yes, and they are very welcome to go look at the database in the cases that we have. Oh, 29% is a typo. They are correct. I'm
Okay,
sorry, it's 79%. Thank you. That is absolutely a typo.
thanks for pointing that out. Whoever that was,
Good catch. Very important typo. Yes. No, it's 79% white. Thank you.
thank you. Has there been research on kids who grow up in homes with domestic violence or the parents who have been charged with violent crimes? Is there a connection to their risk at becoming a mass shooter? I know locally here in Georgia, and I'm just adding this part, we heard of that in relation to two of the recent mass shootings, the Appalachia shootings, there being potentially domestic violence, and then also, whether or not some of the other recent shootings that we've had.
I mean, being a witness and growing up in a home with the domestic violence is a risk factor for a whole host of outcomes, right? That's where it gets complicated. It's a risk factor for mental health, it's a risk factor for substance abuse, it's a risk factor for crime and violence and antisocial stuff. And yes, there is a lot of perpetrators in our database who grew up in homes with domestic violence. I think that's kind of a one of those ACEs that has all sorts of different negative outcomes if not addressed.
Curious about thoughts regarding involving law enforcement interventions during a crisis versus the concern that there may be a desire for suicide by cop. This may also be referring to that, that photo that you showed about the female shooter.
Yeah, and it's true. Like one of the main perpetrators in the book we interviewed said his plan was to be shot by the school resource officer, right? And we hear that more than once. Like that is my plan. I think you have to have law enforcement involved, and ideally you have a strong working relationship with them, whoever you are, a workplace, a school, a church, outside of this happening. I think trouble people run into conflict when this is the first time they've interacted with law enforcement is in a crisis, right? And so you want to have those relationships in place, have those conversations. Um, Sometimes the police have to be involved, right? If there's a gun, the police will be involved. I think there's other forms of mental health crisis, maybe not. When somebody's actively shooting, though, I mean, there's no way to avoid it. But figuring out law enforcement's role in whatever system you build, I think is really important. And law enforcement will say to me, like, there's very much only so much we can do. Like we can check and see if this person has access to a weapon. If they don't, our job's kind of done. But the fact that they're still writing about committing a school shooting, they're not okay, right? Like somebody needs to intervene here. So whose role it is. So I think it's just about figuring out sort of those systems in place. Should law enforcement be responding to a mental health crisis is a much bigger, broader question that I feel like we're having that conversation across the country and co-responding social work models or, alternative to policing models that respond to mental health crisis. Um, Minnesota has, mobile crisis units that are non-law enforcement. I think that's a much bigger, broader question, but I think it's one we're having and thinking about.
Thank you. As a mental health therapist, I'm trained a lot in suicide preventions, but I don't know any good resources for homicide risk assessment or intervention. What should therapists be doing?
Um, I do not have a great answer to that question. I think that is one of the questions we're trying to answer with this new sort of previous provider contact study to be like what I do think suicide is a big portion of it, right? Like I've written a lot about the crossover between suicide and homicide, and how sort of hopelessness being at the core of both of those. Um, I am not a like clinician in practice, so I don't want to answer, but if maybe somebody else has a good answer for that, but that is also like something that we're actively exploring is like what resources, what tools can we give mental health practitioners to be able to screen for this in a more productive way?
Thank you. With the knowledge that so many people are looking for public recognition, are there best practices or guidelines for the way media reports these cases?
Yes. So there is a couple named Tom and Karen Teves who lost their son in the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting, who started a movement called the No Notoriety Movement. And that perpetrator in particular got a ton of media attention. His face was plastered all over the TV, and they were just like, this is exactly what he's looking for. So if you will notice in the last hour and 15 minutes, I haven't said a perpetrator name. That is something I've just trained myself to do.
Hmm.
And I haven't shown a picture. And so the idea is like we can talk about mass shootings, but like don't show the name, don't share the manifesto, don't show the picture, don't give the people this notoriety that they are looking for, right? Like starve them of that because we are active participants in that, right? Like when we share all this stuff, we're kind of feeding into their hands and, motivating the next person. I do think with social media, it's hard, right? Like news, I feel like we were at a place where like news outlets weren't naming people. And there's like certain mass shootings where, like the one that happened at the Oregon Community College, people can't name that shooter because we were right in the middle of like the no notoriety and news outlets were really good about it. We've swung back, like the Annunciation shooter's face was everywhere. And so I think social media makes it hard. Like people will find it and they will share it, but certainly best practices would be if you can minimize, focus on victims, don't share the pictures, don't share the names.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, just one quick short question break as a comment. I appreciate the fact that when a subject matter expert says, I don't know, that is sincerity in trying to find solutions. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
There's a couple of questions just about more of a description on sort of the shooter. So one is, what are your thoughts on the reason most shooters are male? And I'll stop there and we can then answer the next one.
Oh gosh. So this is something that I actually, in retrospect, wish I would have dug into more in the book. Kind of glossed over it. So, I mean, obviously, I've taught whole semester courses on why men commit more violence than women, right? Like, and you can go and it's 90% of homicides are committed by men. And we could to talk about biology and sociology and psychology and why all that is. I think what is unique about mass shootings in particular is one, the copycat effect. So this idea that perpetrators see themselves in previous perpetrators. So, for example, high school shooters still to this day study Columbine, like almost universally. And you will see they tend to be 15 to 16-year-old isolated white males who see themselves in those Columbine shooters. University shooters are vast majority Asian or mixed race. And that is Virginia Tech shooter and San Bernardino sorority shooter, right? Like people see themselves in them and so they reproduce. It's like that profile tends to reproduce itself because those are the people who celebrate and see themselves in those people. I do think there's something about mass shootings that's like there's a narcissism to it. I was owed this and I didn't get it, right? Like society owed me this thing, whether that be money or power or a relationship or whatever it is that I think I'm owed. And the fact that I didn't get that, it must be someone's fault. That I think that is kind of a masculine type of thinking, right? Like this idea that you're owed something and when you don't get it, you're very angry. I think that's a piece of it and sort of a cultural piece around masculinity there. I mean, people will talk about this kind of toxic masculinity. There's definitely a narcissism to this of kind of wanting to be seen, wanting people to know your name. So I think that's all part of it. I was curious when we did have not long ago a female school shooter in Wisconsin, if we would see now more female school shooters since we had an example and we haven't seen that replicating itself.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Does the data support any commonality with shooters in terms of unknown diagnosed learning and or developmental disability?
Yeah, great question. Like literally last week, somebody suggested that we add special education and learning disability to the database. So we are literally coding that. We didn't have it. We have academic performance in there, which we kind of just coded as like low, medium, high, but we did it, and we have if they had a formal diagnosis of a learning disorder, ADHD or something, that would be in there. But we are now working on coding like special education status.
Thank you. Could you say more about the expansion of the database to healthcare settings? Where does this information come from?
hmm So the two databases we're building right now are a database of 25 years of family annihilations. So that's really looking at sort of in-home domestic violence and a database of 25 years of homicides in medical settings. For that one, we are coding any type of homicide occurring in any medical setting. And this is actually at the request of a hospital I gave a presentation to a couple of
Hmm.
months ago who said, like, could you do this? Like, we
Hmm.
don't actually know who's at the highest risk. Is it more patients? Is it domestic? Is it fights that escalate? Like, what causes it? And so we're hoping to just build that data. It's all being built by publicly available information, scraping current databases, news articles. We've got a team of about 16 students working on that one right now, and then it'll get double checked and triple checked. But we're hoping to have that out for people. And I'm not going to claim it's going to be perfect, but what's crazy is that none of this data exists, right? Like, we have students pulling this together so we can actually look and see like what's happening and is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Where are the hot spots? Like, where should we be focused? That's the goal of that database.
Yeah, I guess some of the differences between this database and right, like the Gun Violence Archive also does pull from news reports, but they're not specifically only focused on like all the subsets that you guys are using. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, gun violence archive just has different definitions. They also only go back a few years, right? Like
Hmm.
so we go back further. And I will say also we use court records, we use police records, I mean, there's a lot that's publicly available for a lot
Hmm.
of these cases.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
Another question. Thank you for your conversation. Has your research looked at urban setting and in quotation street violence as well, or is this research focused more on schools, churches, and other locations of public gatherings?
So we haven't done streets just because it's so much. A lot of the homicides in churches, in schools, and college campuses is in parking lots, is at night, right? Is on sidewalks. And so I feel like if we were just trying to make a database of every homicide in the United States, it would just be overwhelming. But I mean, we're getting there. That's the goal. We have done studies of that sort of type of community street violence in different contexts. So we did a big 5-year study looking at specifically Minneapolis and St. Paul, the homicide spike we saw after the murder of George Floyd and after COVID. And we tracked 1,000 homicides during a 5-year period, kind of before, during, after, to try to figure out what caused that spike. And that was every homicide that occurred. Um, and that paper's coming out. So we've done it kind of in small context. To do it on a national scale would just be, I mean, totally overwhelming. And I will also say at this moment, federal funding is cut for research. Our state funding has been cut for research. Our students are volunteer. We have zero full-time staff, right? Like, and so when people are like, why don't you do this? I'm like, gosh, if someone gave me $1 million, I would no problem. There's just like we are operating on a shoestring, kind of doing this mostly as volunteers.
Hmm. We definitely appreciate that. There's a couple of questions in the thread just about related to bullying, so I'm just going to ask one because I think it kind of answers all of them. Have you done any research about how bullying plays a part in school mass shootings?
Yes. And it's a little tricky. Certainly was the person bullied is in the database. Also, was the person a bully is in the database, and it's kind of an even split, interestingly. Like I think some cases these are bullied kids. In some cases, these are kids from really awful home lives who come in hot and who bully as like a protective mechanism, right? And also some of them are both bullied and bully. That is in there. I think it's more social isolation, as I would say, rather than the bullying per se. I mean, bullying is certainly a problem. It's not, I was actually surprised that it didn't seem to be as big of an issue amongst this subset of perpetrators as I thought it would be.
Yeah, there's another question related to schools. How does school funding and teacher burnout affect their ability to connect or spot potential violent acts in youth? I guess if you have any thoughts on that. And then additionally, cuts for social services. Could this speak to politics directly affecting the risk for larger scale violence?
Yes, absolutely. Schools are so stressed and so scrapped, and teachers are so burned out. And it's like, how am I supposed to teach this math curriculum when you've put 33 kids in my class and I'm also supposed to look for signs of violence and crisis, right? Like, and absolutely, that's a piece of it. it's funny in building these care teams in schools, finding 1 hour for like the principal and these people to get together during the week was literally the hardest part of the entire process. And even when you found that hour, somebody's putting out a fire somewhere, right? Like nobody could ever actually be in the same room. Um, I do think that's a big piece of it, right? Like we need to have systems in schools, and some of these you can do with little funding, some of you need more funding, but it's like when I notice a kid is in a crisis, what am I supposed to do? I can't walk him out of the classroom, right? Like I need somebody to cover my classroom. How do I find 15 minutes for this kid? I do think that is a huge piece of it, right? Like school
Hmm.
resources, class sizes, mental health support in schools, all ties in, like it's all connected.
Thank you. Is there a social media toolbox or recommended list of resources that we can use to link people to care and amplify preventive messaging?
No, I wish there was. That would be a great idea.
Mhm.
But I think, yes, that is something we would love to develop. If people have ideas or resources, please let me know.
And we can, from iPrice side, we can, when we send out the PDF, we can pull some of the resources that, we will have, that we
Yep.
typically share with our network. Let me just see, there's a couple of other questions here. We're going to probably do like 2 more minutes for questions. Let's just see here. We get this question a lot generally in other lectures too. So thank you for an amazing presentation. At most schools, as most school shooters are insiders, what are your thoughts about shooter drills? Is there a good way to do the drills, maybe without the students? Do we have data to show how shooter drills are affecting students?
My
And
gosh.
my assumption is that's like student subsequent
Yeah.
behavior.
This is a whole separate webinar for me.
Hmm.
But so I would say a few things. We don't have great data to show they work. Well, because we can't do a randomized control trial. There's been cases where they've probably saved lives. There have been cases where they probably cost lives. Um, if you ask students, they will say after a drill they feel more prepared, and they will say they feel more anxious and afraid and convinced it's going to happen. More and more data emerging that there are certain kids that the drills are very traumatic for, especially if you've experienced violence previously, students on the autism spectrum, students with different learning disabilities, anxious, anxiety, like there's things that the drills are really can be really harmful for certain groups without a lot of evidence that they work. So my recommendations are number one, ideally, I say do the drills with the adults and don't and tell students to listen to adults during a crisis, right?
Hmm.
Because they're always fluid situations. The best thing you want is really good communication strategies amongst teachers and to have the adults know what they're doing, but there's really no reason that the kids necessarily have to be a part of that. Um, Secondly, Minnesota just passed legislation that says that drills must be done in a trauma-informed way. You have to have a debrief period. You have to also do violence prevention training. You have to let parents opt out. You have to give warning. You have to make sure you announce it's a drill. And so, like, there's new language about how to do this in a way to try to alleviate trauma. But whenever I talk to people in other countries, they just cannot believe that we, send kindergartners through 5 active shooter drills a year and have them practice hiding in closets in silence. And I don't think we realize what we're doing to young people in terms of normalizing that type of violence, in terms of building a social script for it. And then, yes, the idea that the perpetrators in the building means that they are running through every single drill along with everybody else and know how the school's going to respond.
Right. Those are all really great points and things for us to consider in our own school systems locally. There's just one more question about the database. So they're expressing appreciation for the database, and if this particular person is doing research, is there information on the website regarding your data collection methods for us to note that in our
Yes.
reports?
There is a whole methodology section on the website that talks about our process.
Great. And then, lots of sort of thank yous in the chat. Thank you so much. This was the best webinar that I attended, both on the quality of
Oh,
research and the way that you presented. And so with that, we will come to a close. Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson, for your time today, and all the information that you've shared really has been thought-provoking for us here on the call. And for our audience, we will share the slides and any specific resources that we have that are related to this talk. Thank you all for attending today.
Thank you so much.